support that they were getting was actually reduced from that, what was then a crumbling communist bloc. So for the South African government trying to repress, they had sanctions, they were financially under the cosh. For the liberation political parties, they also found it difficult to get the same amount of support from the Central or Eastern European bloc of countries. And that's why the Berlin Wall was such an important issue for us in South Africa as well. Now, again, just to recap, and I just want to make the point once again, South Africa really was at the bottom bit here on the African continent. The colonial empires of Portugal in Mozambique and Angola were already crumbling in the mid-1970s, both getting independence, both getting Communist Party governments. The fear of South Africa was that there would be further expansion of communism down south, and eventually the Russians would want control, just as they've used proxy control in Mozambique and Angola. So fear was palpable in South Africa as a result of what was happening in the rest of the continent. Rhodesia, of course, had gained independence as well. And it's important also that since we are hopefully eventually going to Namibia, since we are going to Namibia, it is important to note that that country herself was also under the threat of a potential communist or Marxist takeover. Now, let me just see if I've got the slides more or less right. Just to remind you, for those of you that know not too much about Namibia, Namibia, as it used to be, German Southwest Africa and then Southwest Africa. Don't forget, Germany lost control over this as a colony more or less back in 1920 after the First World War. And South Africa was given the right to administer this huge tract of land as it became known as Southwest Africa. And over the period of 1920 to more or less 1990 or so, for that extended period, South Africa controlled and effectively annexed Southwest Africa, now Namibia, into herself. Now, I've said to you, Angola had become Marxist. Mozambique had become Marxist communist, both of them. Here was a huge tract of land that, in fact, in the minds of South Africa, formed a major geographical buffer between South Africa and, of course, the newly independent and communist Angola. So it was important from a South African security point of view to keep a high level of control over that particular territory and to keep it annexed or ultimately part of South Africa for as long as possible. And in fact, that Southwest Africa area was almost a fifth province of South Africa over that 60, 70-year period or so. Now, so important was it as a buffer against further communist expansion towards the South African borders that military conscription in South Africa was introduced, and South Africa sent tens of thousands of troops to the Southwest Africa border with Angola at the time, in order to prop up the fact that this was largely an enclave of South Africa, a very big enclave at that. The forced military conscription in South Africa, of course, was controversial. A lot of young men of the age of 18 didn't necessarily want to be conscripted into the army. Many of them left South Africa to avoid being conscripted. Many of my friends certainly managed to travel to England or elsewhere and effectively emigrated and certainly ended the association with South Africa for not wanting to go into the army. But those South African troops, the majority of them that went up to that northern border with Angola, they encountered substantial resistance from what was and what became a very major addition to the Angolan forces who were helping to establish an independent Namibia. The use of Cuban forces was very prevalent during that period of the 1970s into the 1980s, and Cuba saw it as a duty, in a sense, part of the broader Soviet bloc, obviously at the time, to assist the independence and liberation movements, particularly that of Namibia, Southwest Africa. Cuba sent tens of thousands of troops to southern Angola, and the South African young conscripts ended up battling Cuban forces in southern Angola. It was not a pretty picture at all from a resource point of view. Lives were lost in the process. And South Africa also became embroiled in this extensive conflict, which was also costly in terms of war finance and in terms of manpower as well. You could only do this for so long. And the United Nations, of course, were clamoring for a full independence of Namibia, which Namibia was eventually granted in 1990. So it was another important factor ultimately for South Africa really to say, look, we simply haven't got the resources, certainly we haven't got the international backing to remain in Southwest Africa. It's time for us also to depart and time for major changes to happen. Very interesting sort of a period since you're traveling in the area. It's just worth mentioning that to you because Namibia itself today is a country, huge country. It's almost the same size as South Africa. It's a bit smaller, but it has less than 3 million people in the whole of the particular territory. And there you will see one of the former Namibian heads of state with Fidel Castro, because Namibia holds a great debt of gratitude, I must tell you, to the Cubans for assisting in their fight for liberation. Like it or not, the Cubans are held in high regard in this part of the world. 1990, of course, saw the independence of Namibia. That's the first president, Sam Nujoma, one of the liberation fighters of the Southwest African People's Organization, known as SWAPO. And today, of course, Namibia, a fully independent country, very reliant upon South Africa, but certainly, as you'll see in Walvis Bay, trying to build a new port, trying to establish a degree of autonomy in terms of exports and imports into that particular country. So I hope all goes well for Walvis Bay, and I hope you see a little bit of the development that's taking place there at the port. But you can read up on the rest of Namibia. The relationship between Namibia and South Africa historically is really interesting because of this buffer that South Africa wanted to try and create using that landmass of Namibia. So, with that said about Namibia and apartheid, let's move on. I showed the slide last time around because, this is what South Africa in part looked like during the 1970s and into the 1980s. We had a number of states of emergency imposed upon us. There was detention without trial, regular police roadblocks. It was a rough environment for many in the country in those 70s and 80s when I grew up. But of course, as I've indicated, we did move to, despite the doomsayers about the country, to a free and fair general election for everyone in the 27th of April 1994. Those were the lines of South Africans queuing up to vote for the first time. 3-day voting exercise. Just to remind you, our political system is one of proportional representation. It's a very easy political system. I'll come to it in a moment. But South Africans, I think, embraced the vote. They certainly embraced the vote the first time they were allowed to vote. But like many other parts of the world, electorates get tired of voting. They become disinterested. They become fed up. They become alienated with their politicians. And the amount of people going out to vote tends to drop. It was bound to be high in our first election, but we have seen a steady drop in interest of South Africans going to the polls. A little bit surprising to me, given that we're not that far away from this first major democratic election. We had all our different political parties and special interest groups around a table to iron out a new constitution for the country, which we like to think is a fine document. It enshrines individual rights across the board. Some might say in this audience, constitutions are just little pieces of paper that can be torn up and thrown out. Indeed, they can be. But we have a very free and fair separation of powers in South Africa. Our constitutional court, fortunately, is able to adjudicate without any fear of political interference on matters that might attack some of the provisions in our constitution. So at least for the moment, it's a major plus for the country that we are able to say our constitutional democracy actually does function, and it functions fairly well. The first number of years of our new democracy necessitated a major change for many South Africans. I mean, you have to think about it. We had to change our flag. Our flag was representative of the old order, Obviously, the old order was not representative of the interests of the majority of South Africans, and therefore the flag was changed and adapted. All our symbols of state were changed and adapted. Our coat of arms became a much more, one might say, Africanized version of what had been a sort of a Eurocentric coat of arms before. There was a substantial campaign to get South Africans on board with sort of a feeling of nationhood, nation building with a new flag. You can imagine, for you sitting here, I'm pretty much sure you've lived with the same flag just about all your lives. For us to change your flag, I mean, it's quite a major thing. So getting used to a new flag was something. We promoted the flag wherever we could. We took London taxi drivers. We brought them here to South Africa, and in exchange, we asked them to paint their black cabs with South African flags. Memorabilia and souvenirs all looked rather nice. You could even buy a Lego set for the South African flag. And everybody, close your eyes if you don't want to see this. I just want to reiterate that this is not me. Regrettably, it's not my physique, but if you wanted this, the flag makes a perfect Y-front underpants design. We were all, I have to say, proudly South African, because the transition to democracy was something that many thought would not happen. Many South Africans thought wouldn't happen. Many outside South Africa were also pessimistic. And yet, despite it all, we managed to prevail over the period. Now, yeah, sounds good. Sounds good, doesn't it? For the African National Congress that won the election, it was entirely predictable that the political party of Nelson Mandela would win the election, and the ANC won the support of over 66% of all voters in South Africa, making this a very powerful political party. But this was a political party that suddenly had to rule a democratic country. It had not had any practice in that. What the African National Congress was ultimately either a liberation political party or a terrorist group, depending on your point of view. And it's not easy for political parties to suddenly move out of that realm and begin to govern, begin to develop sets of policies that take into account all of the necessary interests, parameters, and also current trends in policy making that are necessary. So the ANC had to shift from being a confrontational political group to being a political party in the classic sense of the word, and to negotiate its way into policy making. So not an easy task. And when I give this talk and I look at that particular point that I've got up on the screen, in a sense, that problem for the African National Congress still is there. This is a political party that was built on freeing South Africa from white domination. That was what it was built on. It therefore was almost locked ideologically into those formative years in the 1960s and 70s, when the Soviet Union gave it a lot of support, when the issues surrounding central planning in an economy was quite popular, was quite in vogue. And some of these ideological issues remain within the African National Congress today, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We had, into South Africa, we also had to shift, ultimately, the acceptance of the white community, that they were no longer politically dominant, and we also, from a white perspective, had to understand that majority rule ultimately was going to be the order of the day from now on. Also, I might add, not an easy feat for 5 or 6 million white South Africans who had felt incredibly fearful about this particular change. Many of them, I always remember, my late mother was part of this. I must tell you, before that 1994 election, she said, "Look, Daniel, I know you're not too worried about things, but I'm going to stock up my refrigerator with tinned goods, with non-perishable goods, because I don't know what's going to happen after this particular election." So for many white South Africans, there was a concern as to what the future would ultimately bring them. The African National Congress was no longer a party of liberation. It was now a governing political party, and it had to embark upon policies that would begin to address past imbalances, but also promote economic growth into the future. And one of the great challenges for South Africa, and I could have said this back in 1994 when I was doing analysis, and I can say it right now, and the same issue prevails. You can address past imbalances through all sorts of means, but you've also got to promote economic growth with pragmatic and innovative policies. You can't do one without the other. And one of the big challenges for me in South Africa is that the governing party has really tried to redistribute wealth. Now, that's a controversial issue for sure. That means giving handouts to people, increasing social grants to poor people, fine. But at the same time, the equation has to be balanced with good policy and good governance to grow your economy. You can't dish out cash to people if you don't grow your economy and grow the pie. Otherwise, the pie just shrinks. And that's one of the core challenges that ultimately does exist in South Africa today. The ruling African National Congress is a political party made up of three core elements: the main African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, which was always linked into that ruling African National Congress since the 1960s, and our trade union movement, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So, you don't need me to tell you that there's a constant battle within this governing party, given the influence of the South African Communist Party and given the influence of the trade union movement. And it makes governing very, very difficult. And it's one of the reasons why policy clarity from this African National Congress often gets mired in the internal political wranglings and ideological battles that take place between these three components of the African National Congress. So, I mean, it was quite a challenge for us in South Africa. We had to certainly, I think, establish a strong human rights culture within the country that had largely been decimated over the previous 40, 50 years or so. We had to change our economy to make it more competitive and integrated with the rest of the world because we'd been isolated from the rest of the world for so long. We had to provide social services for poor South Africans who were left behind. We had to create a positive climate for investment within the country. And I mentioned to you before, the region, this whole region of Southern Africa, is essentially an unstable region, or it has been. The levels of growth coming out of some of our other Southern African countries, very, very weak. The whole region has been unstable, and a degree of stability was needed as well. These are very large problems for the country. So in the early years of Nelson Mandela, and I always remind audiences here that I'm sure all of you, by the time you finish with South Africa, you will have seen a lot of pictures of Nelson Mandela. And, we hold him in high regard. Even if you didn't vote for him in an election, South Africans do. But I think what's important to note is that he only served one term in office. He only served for 1 5-year period. He himself said that he was aging and he felt he couldn't really satisfactorily contribute beyond the 5 years that he had in office. And ultimately, when we go back and we look at the legacy of Mandela, what we do look at positively is the legacy of the bringing together of all South Africans that I think he has been credited for. And I think that's important. But in 5 years, it was very difficult to begin any kind of major policy reforms within South Africa. That would have to be left to his predecessors. Mandela, of course, as you know, aged. He was certainly affected after that 27 years in prison, and his death was a major issue here within South Africa, a week or more of mourning, South Africans reflecting upon the legacy of Mandela. He was followed by the second democratically elected president in South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. Mbeki was regarded as what I would call a technocrat. He was an intellectual, didn't have the charisma of Nelson Mandela. And Mbeki also ran into trouble with his own political party. In fact, he didn't complete his full term of office. He was rather unceremoniously booted out of office as a result of internal wranglings in his own party. Those of you from the United Kingdom here will appreciate internal wranglings in ruling political parties, and South Africa's got a history of it. This president didn't complete his term because his own party fell out over him. And the next president, Jacob Zuma, also didn't complete his term because his own party fell out with him. And of course, he was accused of all sorts of nefarious activities that are still being judged within South Africa. In fact, the former President Zuma has spent much of his retirement years in and out of court trying to delay a legal trial against him for graft and corruption. So the track record, let me be honest about it with you, because you often get a speaker, and the speaker will only say wonderful things. But the track record here of leadership in particular has been weak, to put it mildly. So once Jacob Zuma was removed from office, the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, took office. And of course, the promise from Ramaphosa was that he would begin to clean up the rot, this sort of degradation that had seeped in to the leadership, and in particular to the ruling African National Congress. Now, let's just have a look at some of the successes and failures of South Africa. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way, just to make the point that some of these big issues that affect you or anywhere else in the world clearly have affected us as well. Our economy was not strong before COVID. When COVID hit our economy, of course, we felt it even more. We closed down our economy for the better part of a year to 18 months or so. We had very onerous COVID restrictions in South Africa. At one point, liquor was banned for sale in our stores. At one point, cigarettes were banned as well from being sold. When you ban cigarettes from being sold, what happens? The bootleggers, the illegal dealers, come out onto the streets, and you could have bought illegal cigarettes. They did very well, often making us cynical South Africans question whether this was an intended plan to give some benefits to those bootleggers who sell illegal tobacco. So COVID hit a weak economy. The issues now facing you in other parts of the world and here are the same in South Africa. We have an inflation rate that has crept up substantially. Remember, in South Africa, we don't have our own oil. It's all imported. And a lot of our inflation is a result of high oil prices. Our inflation rate is at about 7.6% currently. We've got rising interest rates in South Africa, just as you have elsewhere. Our rates went up another 0.75 basis points just yesterday. We also have the lasting effects of the global economic downturn as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war that will have an effect on our major trading partners and potentially affect our exports into those weaker economies as well. And of course, issues relating to climate change, water shortages, particularly in the western parts of South Africa, also have an economic impact. So the global factors are there, and if your economy is already in difficulty, well, you can do the math, so to speak. Now, what's good about South Africa? Well, what I like about our democratic change is that we have a very broad-based democracy. In fact, it's a wild, unfettered democracy in South Africa where, frankly, you can say anything you like and no one really bats an eyelid. Now, that's a change from when I grew up in South Africa. And here's our parliament. Take note of our parliament, everybody, because you cannot see this right now. That parliament burnt down only about a year and a half ago. And you can see the little inset there of the fire that engulfed our quite attractive National Assembly Parliament, and it hopefully will be rebuilt. I hope I live long enough, frankly, to see this project being rebuilt. But nevertheless, we have a 400-seat Parliament, a proportional representation chamber. It's very easy. If a political party gets 51% of the overall vote, they get 51% of the seats in our national parliament. It's as easy as that. So we have a large dominant party, the African National Congress, and we have a series of opposition parties, some of them who like to cause a degree of chaos from time to time on the benches, and it adds to the entertainment value. Sometimes, frankly, it's much better to watch our parliamentary television channel than to watch a soap opera or anything else. Put this stuff on and you can have your entertainment for the day. We have a very, very free media in South Africa. That's a big plus for me because I work in areas related to the media. You can, again, publish just about anything. We have media watchdogs, obviously, but there's full criticism of the government and of individual members of the government, and South Africans really are free to speak their mind, and that is different to when I grew up in South Africa. We have a very active political party system within the country. Those are the heads of our three biggest parties. President Ramaphosa here on the right, the leader of our opposition in the middle, and on the left there, the younger upstart who models himself very much on Hugo Chavez. Some of you will remember Hugo Chavez from Venezuela. Well, if you want a Hugo Chavez clone, for better or for worse, there he is on the left-hand side of your screen. But it doesn't stop there. We've got a myriad of political parties. These are all opposition parties, but sometimes I think opposition parties tend to dislike each other more than the actual main government that they are supposed to be fighting. But there you go. It's a very active political system. We've also, in the last 27, 28 years or so, we've expanded the black middle class in South Africa. And for obvious reasons, black South Africans were excluded by and large from holding responsible positions. This has substantially changed. Our corporates are beginning to transform away from being purely white to being, pretty mixed. There's a lot of pressure on this from an affirmative action perspective within South Africa, and some, of course, will argue that the pressure is too great. The application of affirmative action in South Africa has not been without controversy, I might add. We certainly have an increase in the amount of black South Africans who now own their own homes. They might not be the most luxurious homes, but we are rolling out houses, not enough, I might add, but there is a backlog, but nevertheless a major improvement on that. Remember, black South Africans could not really own their own title deed to a home prior to 1990 or so, when they were given a 99-year-old leasehold. So black South Africans now obviously can own homes. The black middle class in South Africa has become a very powerful economic entity, and again, that's as a result of the full